from the 1820s, huge amount of Aboriginal land has been taken up. And there is this enormous struggle between Aboriginal people and whites. Of course, it's very hard to document a lot of the settler violence because they know that it is against the law to kill Aboriginal people. They are being told that Aboriginal people are British subjects, but they certainly reveal in their diaries and journals the desire to kill Aboriginal people.
It was essentially a factory to transform so-called savages into civilised Christians. Forced to adopt an alien way of life, they began to succumb to European diseases and what the local doctor called dejected spirits.
They die one by one by one. Children are not being born, and there must have been this enormous sense of trauma amongst them. A people that had once been strong and healthy, suffering this enormous decline within a generation.
Across the world, indigenous peoples were being pushed to the brink of extinction. In the South African Cape, the Khoisan peoples had been driven from their land, enslaved and killed in their thousands by British settlers and the Boers. The same forces had also attacked the ancient San Bushmen of the Kalahari, hunting them down as if they were animals. In Newfoundland, the native Beothuk peoples had been completely wiped out by Europeans. And in South America, wars of extermination sanctioned by the Argentinian government were raging against the Pampas Indians. Everywhere, it seemed, white settlers were destroying indigenous peoples. And in these very same years, the old racism that had been born in the age of slavery began to re-emerge. In North America, centuries of disease and war had devastated the Native Americans. Whole nations had been all but annihilated. In parts of the Australian mainland, the peoples of the outback were, it seemed, going the same way as their cousins in Tasmania. And across Africa, the scramble for empire had brought the might of Europe to bear against innumerable peoples, killing literally millions. The social Darwinists predicted a future in which these races, like many animal species, would only be remembered as curios, stuffed exhibits in anthropological museums. The white man's burden and the Christian dream of benign imperialism were rendered obsolete. In the mid-1870s, the Great Deccan Plain of India was affected by the climatic phenomenon we now know as El Niño, and within months, millions of peasants had begun to starve.
The monsoons had failed, people had eaten their food reserves. India stood on the precipice of a great human tragedy. At this point, the Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton, was totally absorbed in what was probably the largest party in world history, celebrating the coronation of Queen Victoria as Empress of India. This is one of the great catering feats in history, since it meant wining and dining more than 60,000 satraps and princes and retainers and friends of the British Empire in India over the course of a long week.
As Lord Lytton and the ruling elite of the Raj feasted at banquets and posed for official photographs, millions were slowly dying in the countryside. And the Viceroy justified his inaction with arguments gleaned from the social Darwinists.
This was a very, very crass use of a Darwinian evolutionary notion of survival of the fittest, whereby a famine could be actually seen as an instrument of Darwinian winnowing. Yes, that people who were unfit would effectively perish as a result of this. And to intervene to stop them perishing was really to interfere with almost a rule of nature.
What made the famines especially deadly was that the British had dismantled ancient systems that had for centuries prevented food shortages from turning into famines.
If you'd had a poor monsoon and there was a food shortage, many people still had enough. They may have had less, but they would have had enough because they grew their own food, or they would have had access to it from other groups in the community who would share it with them during a time of crisis.
All this had been wiped away when the British forced the poorest peasants to grow cash crops like wheat and rice for export, thereby ushering them into a global market. And in the 1870s, that market condemned them to death. By 1877, millions in southern and central India were starving. In desperation, parents sold their children for scraps of food. Many thousands committed suicide, and in some places, the people were forced into cannibalism. And all the while, the food that could have saved them was piled up on the docks of Madras, ready to be shipped to Britain and America. But to Lord Lytton, it was no more than an unfortunate byproduct of the iron laws of social Darwinism.
If you read the letters of Lord Lytton, what is so striking about them is not simply their fanatical devotion to the market and market forces. It's not simply their parsimony and desire to spend as little as possible, but the enormous calm with which they accept the fact that millions of Indians would die, because these are Indians they believe are the useless part of the population, the poorest of the poor, people condemned to death by nature.
When finally Lytton was pressured into action, his solution proved just as deadly as the famine itself.
Lord Lytton sets up a system of outdoor relief that looks more like Nazi concentration camps than anything representing decent human charity. First of all, there's the obligatory test. You can't be relieved, that is, given a job or food within 10 miles of your residence. You must walk. And you must walk sometimes distances of hundreds of kilometers, and tens of thousands of people die in the course of that. Then you're put to work doing heavy labor, very heavy labor, breaking stone, working on the railroads, and you're confined then to squalid camps where your daily diet is in caloric terms less than that provided to inmates of Buchenwald and other Nazi concentration camps. They become literally and simply death camps. And perhaps worst of all, children were now too weak and small to do the necessary work. Children became the main victims of Lytton's cool-hearted policy.
"8 million Indians died in the famines of the 1870s. But they were not the only famines of the British Raj, and they were not the last. Famines returned in the 1880s and the 1890s, and in all, almost 30 million Indians starved to death under British rule. A story airbrushed out of the glorious accounts of the Raj and the men who ruled over it. This is Namibia, but at the dawn of the 20th century, it was the German colony of southwest Africa and home to an ancient people called the Herero. In 1904, they rebelled against the brutality of German rule. What followed was to prefigure the worst crimes of the 20th century. The Germans committed innumerable massacres and atrocities, but they were unable to hunt down and destroy all the Herero people across such a vast landscape. And when the Nama, another of the Namibian peoples, rose up, the Germans turned instead to a recent invention, the concentration camp. In these camps, the Herero and Nama were imprisoned and enslaved. Thousands were worked to death, others raped, beaten, or simply murdered by the guards.
The genocides which took place in Namibia in 1904 to 1909, they are the precursor to what happens in the Nazi period. They are the precursor. They have the same symptoms in the sense that you can see the bureaucratization of mass killing. And this, for me, is the central thing. This is not just killing for killing. No. It's a combination between killing and bureaucracy.
Today, Shark Island is a campsite for tourists. The Africans who were frozen and starved to death here have been almost erased from memory. Many of those who feared that mass immigration would lead to widespread racial mixing look to the ideas of eugenics, an increasingly powerful science.
Eugenics flourished, mutated, and went out of control when it got to the United States. And the irony is that the eugenics movement in the United States, which certainly descended directly from Galton, had the great advantage of having a lot of money, a huge amount of money.
Some of that money was used to establish the Eugenics Records Office, ran by the infamous Charles Davenport. In order to defend the health and purity of the white race, Davenport and his followers sought to identify those classes and those races in America whom they considered genetically unfit. Identified and monitored, the scientists would then take control of their lives and their fertility.
Once you were identified as a certain class, it meant what school you could go to, what cemetery you could be buried in, where you could live. It was a matter of life and death. Marriage laws were established in dozens of states around the United States, saying that people could not marry outside of their group. Blacks could not marry whites, Indians could not marry blacks. In Virginia, if you married the wrong person, meaning interracial marriage, they would unmarry you, they would invalidate your marriage.
27 states passed eugenics marriage laws, and the eugenicists spread their message using the new medium of cinema. The propaganda was intended to protect the genetic health of the white race. This would be achieved by eradicating those deemed unworthy through forced mass sterilization.
They went about methodically tracking ancestry and targeting bloodlines for extinction. That's eugenics, the effort to create a white, master, blonde, blue-eyed, master race.
Eugenics was a worldwide movement. In Sweden, an official program forcibly sterilized 60,000 people, mental patients and members of the ethnic minorities. In Britain, the Eugenics Society received widespread support from across the political spectrum. But it was in Germany that the radical ideas of the American eugenics movement found its most receptive audience. But the colonial genocides, inspired and justified by the 19th century theorists, have been written out of Europe's history. The horrors of the Shark Island death camp, the destruction of the Tasmanian Aboriginals, the 30 million victims of the Indian famines, all have been forgotten. The erasure of this memory encourages the belief that Nazi violence was an aberration in European history. Though the Holocaust itself was motivated by the fanatical anti-Semitism of the Nazis, it can also be seen as part of a longer historical continuum, one that identifies it as a logical extension of scientific racism.